And it will be available on the UHN Memory Clinic website as well as AST's YouTube channel. Just so you know, for today, the presentation is about an hour and a half long, and then there will be time at the end for questions. If you do need to step away momentarily, please feel free to. So we'll just wait 1 or 2 more minutes and we'll get started just to make sure everyone has a chance to join. Okay. Just in the interest of time, I'd like to get started. So I would like to start by introducing our speaker today. Our speaker today is Nesanet Girma. Nesanet graduated with a Master of Science degree in Speech Language Pathology at Western University in 2006. Since 2007, Nesanet has worked with the Crumble Neuroscience Program at Toronto Western Hospital, assessing and treating adult patients with swallowing or communication disorders. The adult population Nesanet serves includes those with neurodegenerative disorders, cerebrovascular accidents, traumatic brain injury, brain tumors, and anoxic brain injuries. As a speech-language pathologist within a teaching hospital, Nesanet is involved in research on aphasia and swallowing disorders. She is also responsible for clinical education of SLP students, presenting in services for staff, providing education sessions to patients and their families, and participating in interprofessional endeavors. Nesanet's endeavors as a speech-language pathologist have extended abroad, as she recently taught about swallowing assessment and treatment at the University of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Nesanet holds a status-only appointment in the Department of Speech-Language Pathology at the University of Toronto as the rank of lecturer. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. An honor to be able to present to the members of the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto. Okay. Should I start?
You're more than welcome to start.
Okay. All right, so the presentation today is on swallowing and communication changes in dementia. And we're going to be exploring how we can capitalize on preserved skills and compensate for deficits that may occur during the disease progression. First, I'm going to start out with a story about a woman named Anna. She's a fictional character, but she serves to give us a context to the presentation and give us some real life examples of what might be occurring in the process of dementia. Then we'll talk about dementia itself, give a definition, talk about the cognitive skills that are typically impacted by dementia, and the skills that are typically preserved. Then we'll discuss general strategies for memory and other cognitive skills, and then talk about protective and preventative factors versus the risk factors in developing dementia, particularly Alzheimer's. Then we'll look at Anna's particular case and look at protective and risk factors for her case. We'll also look at communication and look at what communication disorders are, what normal or typical changes that occur in typical aging and communication, and then the impact of dementia on communication. We'll also talk about the reducing the impact of dementia on our communication abilities. Lastly, before we get into swallowing, we'll talk about preserving function and choosing treatment that is appropriate for each individual. And then look at even technology to help support that. And then we'll go back to Anna and talk about how to create a treatment plan for her. The last section we'll be talking about swallowing and the normal swallowing processes and changes in swallowing that typically happen as we age. In addition, we're going to look at dementia and how it impacts swallowing. Then we'll discuss the ways that we can reduce the impact of dementia on swallowing and end with difficult discussions that may have to take place on end-of-life care. Okay. So here's Anna's story. Born in October of 1945, Anna was the youngest of 10 children in the rural area of Jarabacoa, Dominican Republic, where agriculture was central to the wealth and prosperity of the community. It was no surprise that when Anna finished grade 5, she had to leave school to help her family on the farm. Anna was known for her beauty, natural intelligence, and wit, as well as her fantastic cooking skills. She was well loved by her immediate and extended family and the community. She was outgoing and had a wealth of friends and of various backgrounds, and some of whom ventured to socialize with wealthy vacationers from large cities. When Anna was 17, she caught the eye of the son of a wealthy landowner, developer, visiting from Santo Domingo, the capital. They married in 1963 when Anna turned 18, with her family's blessings. She moved to Santo Domingo, where she learned to hide her limited education using her vivacious personality and her ability to learn to imitate the language, style, and mannerisms of the middle upper class that she had suddenly become a part of. Anna had impeccable style, which together with her natural beauty, made her the envy of Santo Domingo's affluent society. She went on to have 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy, and she raised them with the love and warmth that she was accustomed to in her large rural beginnings. Her husband was a good provider, a gentle man who was supportive and kind. He valued formal learning, so he ensured that all of his children received quality education in the best schools in Santo Domingo. Unfortunately, due to corruption and a series of misinformed decisions, the business that Anna's husband had inherited from his family soon fell into bankruptcy. They were bitter about his loss and decided to leave the Dominican with the help of family abroad. In 1974, Anna and her family moved to the United States, where they eventually settled in Newark, New Jersey. They were overwhelmed with the sadness and anxiety at the thought of having to start over in this foreign and comparatively ugly country everyone talked so highly about, but they focused on trying their best to attain the American dream while helping their families back home. They used their remaining savings to open a corner shop specializing in Latin American products. Slowly, Anna started selling her home-cooked food as well. Although Anna was not proficient in English, she learned enough to get. Luckily, there was a growing Latino population in Newark, so she was able to come to know and communicate with many community members in her native language, Spanish. People from all around the city would drive to the shop for her rich and authentic Dominican food, particularly her fried chicken and pork, rice and beans, as well as fried plantain. Her life consisted of working at the shop, taking care of her family, and socializing with friends she had made in her apartment complex. Weekend evenings were always busy with one party or another, where Anna and her husband indulged in a good amount of rum, dancing, bachata, and merengue in dimly lit apartments thick with cigarette smoke. Soon, Anna and her husband saved up enough money to buy a house in Orange, New Jersey, a middle-class suburb with not as many Latinos, but they maintained their connection to the old neighborhood through the shop. Life was good, and Anna was happy to see her kids grow into mature adults. She was proud that all of them got into college with scholarships. Her girls both eventually became nurses, and her son graduated as an engineer. They eventually settled down, married, and moved to neighboring boroughs. When Anna became a grandmother, she was thrilled and slowly began to spend less and less time at the shop in order to help raise her grandchildren. Over the next 20 or 30 years, Anna's life focused more and more on her children and grandchildren's lives. She felt fulfilled and useful, and her family was grateful for her help. In 2012, Anna and her husband decided to sell their beloved shop. The neighborhood had changed anyway, as all of her friends had decided to take their savings and move back to the DR to live closer to family and get away from the harsh New Jersey winters. Anna and her husband paid off their mortgage and began to enjoy their retired life. They traveled to DR every year, but never relocated in order to remain close to the children and grandchildren. In 2015, Anna developed pneumonia, which resulted in a hospitalization for over 3 weeks. This was unbearable for an independent and active woman like Anna, who was rarely ill and barely ever visited her family doctor. In hospital, she was found to be diabetic and to have high blood pressure. When she returned home, her husband noticed subtle changes in Anna. She would return home from the grocery store with several of the same products that she had bought a couple of days before. Her food was sometimes burnt or lacking the usual richness and flavor that he was accustomed to. She was repeating stories and forgetting the details of recent conversations. Slowly, she was becoming less and less interested in house cleaning, though she had always prided herself on keeping an immaculate home. She became more withdrawn and wasn't as interested in calling her children or making surprise visits to bring friends or family her delicious food. Her husband was concerned about these changes, so he convinced Anna to visit her family doctor, who made a referral to a local neurology clinic. After several visits that including taking tests, having neuroimaging, interviewing her and her husband, as well as one of her daughters, Anna was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment with concerns for early stages of dementia. Anna's story serves to remind us that Anna had her own unique life experiences, personality, and before the diagnosis of dementia. Although there is a common general pattern of deterioration, the specific impact and expression of dementia on someone like Anna will be unique to Anna, to her own experiences and personal factors. Any relevant interventions proposed to treat or compensate for deterioration have to consider Anna's own preferences, experiences, and priorities. This presentation will explore general patterns of deterioration in cognition-related communication skills, and in swallowing. General strategies and treatment options based on research will also be discussed. Anna's story will then be used to illustrate how to consider a given person as a whole, along with their caregivers, when making practical, person-centered decisions for interventions related to dementia. Finally, we will also discuss considerations for end-of-life care when swallowing skills are no longer functional. So let's look at the definition of dementia. So dementia is an acquired disorder involving deterioration more than one cognitive domain below previous levels. It has to be severe enough to impair normal daily functioning. And memory impairment must be present in addition to deficits in other cognitive domains. So memory has to be central. It's a prerequisite. The most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, which affects about 5% of those over 65 and 50% of those over 90. The number of people with dementia is expected to triple over the next 30 years. Not all causes of dementia are known. Small percentages related to the apolipoprotein gene, which results in plaques and tangles in the brain. These plaques are called beta amyloid, and tangles are made of tau protein, and these impair function in the brain so that eventually there become impairments in memory and other cognitive skills. So the cognitive skills that are typically impacted by dementia are episodic memory, executive function, and attention. So episodic memory is the progressive impairment in the acquisition and retention of new information or events. So for instance, if someone were to have a phone conversation and not remember the details of the telephone conversation earlier that day, or not remember having had a telephone call at all. Executive function is a collective of cognitive skills that are essential for successful performance of an independent, goal-directed behavior, such as cooking or shopping or telling a coherent story. And attention is comprised of two parts, divided attention, so doing two things at once, so dividing your attention between two tasks, and selective attention, attending to a stimulus when other distractors are present, so like reading a book when the television is on. So the cognitive skills typically impacted, like executive function and attention, impair episodic memory and get worse with dementia. So for instance, if you were not able to remember the details of a phone conversation 1 month, maybe several months later, you won't remember having a conversation at all. So the extent of the episodic memory impairments will become more and more severe, as will the executive function and attention abilities. The types of memory that are typically preserved for quite a while are semantic memory and implicit memory. Semantic memory is your general knowledge of people, world knowledge, and is affected to a lesser extent and at a later stage of the disease. Okay. Implicit memory are things like procedural learning, such as knowing how to knit or how to ride a bike. These are skills and habits, and there's no real need for active recollection of information. Learning is usually expressed through performance or behavior. Okay, so let's talk about some of the strategies that may compensate for, let's say, episodic memory. So the use of memory aids and environmental adjustments, sticky notes in places to remind you to take your purse, those kinds of things. That's one general strategy. Also training skills and routines that involve the performance of an action. So manipulating particular objects, like what's involved in setting a table or preparing a meal. So doing these things over and over and over again with support from others. So you have set sort of skills, motor skills that you do habitually. Learning is more effective if it's spaced across learning sessions and performed within the area that you're going to be doing that task. Tasks relying on implicit memory can be supported by maintaining consistency in daily activities and in the person's environment. So consistency in the practice and the environment is really important, so that you rely less on episodic memory and just more on motor memory. So for instance, putting frequently used items in a consistent and visible location. So it becomes automatic that you go to that particular cupboard to get a bowl. In order to help with deficits in executive function, it's recommended that you take complex steps and break them into individual steps. So break down the act of cooking into grabbing the ingredients, cutting the vegetables, that kind of thing. And being there for the person with dementia to give instructions one at a time, using short, simple sentences, and even demonstrating. In order to make up for deficits in attention, avoiding multitasking situations, so you're doing one task at a time, and reducing environmental distractions like the television or radio. So this is just an acronym called RECAPS to help remember some of these cognitive strategies. So reminders, spoken prompts, written word picture reminders placed in key places, making sure that there's a permanent place for objects and it's consistent from day to day, having a routine, and avoiding distractions so that you can focus on a particular task, and then doing the same tasks the same way every day, and simplifying the steps so that we break down complex tasks into simple tasks. Okay. So let's go on now to talk about some of the protective or preventative factors in the development of dementia versus our risk factors. So there are things that we can't do anything about. These are called non-modifiable risk factors, such as our age, which is the strongest non-modifiable risk factor. There's also whether or not we have the APOE genotype. So this genotype results in low levels of a protein called the apolipoprotein, whose role it is to remove amyloid plaques so that there becomes a buildup of neurotoxic amyloid beta and t-tau protein in the brain, which results in higher risk for cognitive decline. We also can't do anything about our gender and sex hormones. So there are inherent risks of being an older female in developing Alzheimer's type dementia, whereas males are more at risk in developing vascular dementia. Estrogen is thought to have to help increase cerebral blood flow, and it has neuroprotective factors. But unfortunately, estrogen therapy has limited therapeutic value in that it only helps in the first 5 years after menopause, and then thereafter can actually be detrimental to cognition. And then low testosterone levels in men make men more vulnerable to cognitive decline. And testosterone therapy has only yielded an improvement in, like marginal improvement in cognitive function. So then let's go on to modifiable risk factors that we may have some control over. So one risk factor is depression, which is still in question whether it's a risk factor or actually an early symptom of a dementia. Both depression and dementia share common neuropathological processes. Obesity is also another risk factor because it's thought that inflammation and oxidants caused by obesity affect the brain much in the same way as it does other arteries and organs, leading to neurodegeneration. It's also often associated with other risk factors such as diabetes and hypertension. And diabetes is characterized by insulin resistance or insufficiency, and it changes our plasma and increases our oxidative stress, leading to cognitive changes and eventually dementia. There is promising therapy using intranasal insulin that may help verbal memory and story recall in those with the APO genotype. Also, there's hypertension, which impacts cerebral circulation, causing changes in white matter and damaging small arteries. It's thought that by controlling blood pressure, particularly in our sleep, it decreases our risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. However, hypertension in the very old, so the oldest old, has actually a protective factor so that it promotes circulation of blood in the brain and compensates for vascular changes that may actually make an elderly person hypotensive. So other risk factors are dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease. One interesting one is sleep disturbances. There's a clear relationship between sleep disturbance and the development of dementia, but the actual nature of that relationship is not clear. But people with obstructive sleep apnea it's actually thought that the sleep apnea itself may start the Alzheimer's disease neuropathological process. And so treatment of sleep apnea, let's say with a CPAP machine, reduces sleep fragmentation and neurotoxin buildup, improving cognitive function. Unfortunately, treatment of sleep disturbances with sleep aid does not result in protective factor and may in fact increase the risk of dementia. We also have smoking, which does add oxidative stress and vascular dysfunction leading to dementia. Surprisingly, there's no strong evidence for passive or infrequent smoking and the development of dementia. Looking at alcohol use, research shows that the two extremes, heavy drinkers and abstainers are at higher levels or at higher risk of developing dementia, whereas lower risk, there's lower risk for developing dementia for light to moderate drinkers. Other risk factors are chronic stress and hearing loss. Let's look at protective factors in decreasing or delaying the onset of dementia. So research has shown that higher level of education and cognitive reserve is associated with, and particularly in early life, up to the age of 11 or 12 years old, stimulates the brain to build cognitive reserve needed to reduce the risk of dementia. It's thought that having this early excellent education may promote the ability of the brain to tolerate the burden of dementia without actually showing evidence in daily life. So there may be changes that in a diseased brain, but you're able to bear that burden without actually expressing it in daily life, so people won't notice it. Another protective factor is social engagement. So having strong social ties or positive social supports lowers your risk for developing dementia. It is thought that the mechanism by which this happens is that social engagement stimulates cognitive function and help maintain the brain reserves needed to prevent or delay dementia symptoms. Positive social supports also is thought to reduce the effects of other risk factors like chronic stress, smoking, alcohol misuse, obesity, and depressive mood. It should be pointed out that it's not certainly the number of contacts, but the perceived satisfaction with social ties that was more important in lowering your risk for developing dementia. Another protective factor is a healthy diet. So regular intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and fish reduces the risk of later life dementia. A healthy diet also reduces your other risk factors in obesity. And this in turn improves memory and attention. Diet also reduces risk factors such as hypertension and diabetes. Another protective factor is physical activity. So at least an hour of vigorous exercise several times a week, combined with that Mediterranean style diet described above, is known to reduce your risk of developing dementia or delay the development of dementia. Research has shown that Alzheimer's markers in the cerebrospinal fluid changed in relation to aerobic exercise. So there's actual physiological changes that occur when we engage in exercise. Participating in leisure and cognitively stimulating activities also provides protection against the development of dementia. Stimulating activities such as board games. So the more cognitively stimulated you are, the less likely, or the more you're able to delay the onset. The greater number of activities and the amount of time devoted to hobbies is also related to risk factors, or lowering risk factors. So it should be pointed out that a multi-domain intervention targeting multiple risk factors and maximizing protective factors may preserve and improve cognition, like clinically, rather than targeting only one or two of these things. Personalizing the interventions makes or creates buy-in from the person with dementia, and so that we're not choosing what the treatments are. We're actually including the person with dementia in choosing what is of interest to them. I think that's very, very central to having success in treatment. Okay. So let's go back to Anna's story and try to make this a little bit more applicable. So let's look at the type of impairments that we see from the story. There's evidence of impaired episodic memory in the fact that she's forgetting that she had bought the same products a few days ago, and so she'd go back to the store and buy the same products again. And she had started repeating stories, so not remembering that she had told the story before. Executive functioning is also impaired. So her husband had noticed that her cooking was not the usual that he's accustomed to. So she was burning food and the flavor wasn't there, which is an indication that she's missing ingredients or there's too much of a particular ingredient. If we look at Anna, she's right now about 77 or 75. She's female and we don't know her genotype history. She does have modifiable risk factors that increase the risk of dementia. So she has hypertension, diabetes, and although she loves cooking, she is cooking food that is high in saturated fats, and she's likely slightly overweight. If we look at her background, she stopped school in grade 5, so she has a lower level of formal education, which puts her at higher risk for developing dementia. And she's physically less active. She's retired, and by the end of her time in the story, her grandchildren are older, and her friends have sort of moved away back to the Dominican, so she's not engaging in the dancing and things that she normally would have been. It's also in the story noted that she is withdrawing from activity, so that could be a symptom of depression, and perhaps environmental factors like not being as needed by her grandchildren, so not engaging with family as much. So although over the years she has focused more and more on her family and it was fulfilling, she is lacking in peers and satisfying social ties as friends have moved away. Protective factors that might offset some of those risk factors are the strong social engagement and positive social support that she has from her immediate family, her kids and her grandchildren. She does live with her husband, who is very supportive, and they do travel and have some leisure time with their yearly trips to the Dominican. This isn't mentioned in the story, but she does use technology like a smartphone and social media like Facebook to stay connected to some friends, and she even enjoys playing some games like Candy Crush on her iPhone. Okay. So let's just pause for a second and see if there's any questions.
There is one question, but it's more related to a communication. So perhaps we can answer that once we get into a bit more of that presentation.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we'll go on to the communication aspect now. So let's first start by defining what a communication disorder is. And communication disorder is an impairment in the ability to receive, comprehend, and send verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbol messages. It may involve the process of hearing, language, speech, or cognition. And it can also affect things like American Sign Language, so motor movements that are symbolic. It can range in severity from mild to profound, and it can be developmental or acquired. A person may demonstrate one or any combination of the above. Normal aging results in changes in hearing, voice, and speech processes. Age, you can actually predict the age of a person by listening to their voice. So because of things like voice tremor, the pitch of the voice. So men will tend to have higher pitch as they get older, their speaking rate, their loudness, and fluency. Typically, as we age, our vocabulary and grammatical judgment and ability to repeat is preserved. And comprehension of complex utterances decline due to slower auditory processing, but we can still understand them. Naming and word finding skills decline, but neither has significant impact on the ability to express oneself adequately and to complete everyday tasks. The impact of dementia on communication is within the areas of semantic memory. So impairments in semantic memory, executive function that we've already discussed, and attention not only impact the activities of daily living, but also communication. So deficits in semantic memory are associated with word finding difficulties, reduced verbal fluency. So for instance, naming as many animals as you can in 1 minute, and naming difficulties. So the ability to look at an object and retrieve the name of that object. Deficits in working memory, attention, and cognitive slowing results in reduced auditory comprehension. So you can see the cognitive substrates are impacting our ability to comprehend. Deficits in executive function and episodic memory impact conversation, so that conversation is off topic, or irrelevant utterances are stated, or there's poor topic management. So you start a topic and you can't maintain that topic, you start being tangential. Increased repetition of ideas and thoughts, lack of coherence, and reduced language is also noted and associated with executive function and episodic memory. So how can we reduce the impact of dementia on communication? In conversation, for instance, if we have sufficient context and we know the word that the person that we're talking to is trying to come up with, we can give a phonemic cue, like the first sound, or a semantic cue, like, do you mean the thing that you hang your clothes on, to refer to clothes hanger. These are sort of unnatural kind of cues. So usually what we'll do is, do you mean you want the coat or the hanger from the closet? So multiple choice is more effective in helping with word retrieval. Things that can facilitate auditory comprehension is reducing the sentence length and complexity, using higher frequency words rather than more obscure words, repeating a certain idea and paraphrasing it in different ways to facilitate comprehension. And then using single choice or yes/no questions to check comprehension. Also, it's important to pause between information to allow for the patient's processing to catch up. In order to facilitate auditory comprehension, it's also important to remove attentional demands, so environmental distractors, just like we did with cognitive issues, and then to sort of exaggerate or capitalize on nonverbal communication to augment spoken language. So using hand gestures that are appropriate, facial expression, meaningful gesture accompanying spoken language. Also using the appropriate tone. So this is another aspect of non-verbal language. So the tone is something that people are sensitive to even in the late stages of dementia. So vocal quality, volume, and communication style. Critical emotions and expressions of harshness are predictive of negative behaviors in a person with dementia. So using a soft tone, a soft and soothing tone leads to more responsiveness and reduced disruptive behavior. Even when communication is severely impacted, we know that communicative intent is retained in even the later stages of dementia. So it's important to sort of acknowledge and understand that the person is still trying to communicate and trying to use the context, the time of day to try to figure out what the message that the person is trying to communicate. Okay, so this is another acronym just to help with remembering some of those strategies. So maximizing attention, watching your expression, being aware of your nonverbal language, keeping it simple, using supporting spoken language by allowing the person to have time to find a word, you repeating and rephrasing information so that they understand, and reminding the person of the particular topic they started speaking about so that they can maintain the topic. Assisting with visual aids, so gesture, even simple communication boards and things like that. And then you doing your part to try to get the message. It's important to be encouraging and actually continue to try to engage in communication through all the different stages of dementia. Okay. So now we're into preserving function and choosing treatment. And as I've said from the beginning of this presentation, we're trying to maximize the residual functional, or we're trying to maximize the skills that are remaining, and using the person's own interests in order to create meaningful goals. So the development of goals in treatment involve both the person helping to create the treatment, but also the person who's going to benefit from the treatment. That is the person with dementia. If a team is helping out with this process of forming treatment, then a standardized tool can be used, like the Comprehensive Geriatric Assessment Battery. But if that kind of support is not available, family members can, through observations, try to understand what supports and strategies the person may require to achieve their goals. And then also treating those modifiable factors that we discussed before to prevent and delay further progression. We're lucky at this time in history that there's a great number of accessible technology that is being used in the general population that can be used for people with dementia. So technology can support or promote preservation of cognitive and communication skills by supporting participation in leisure and social activities. And it can facilitate independence by supporting completion of activities of daily living. So I'll give you examples of that. So we have things like voice assisted technology like Alexa, Siri, and Cortana. I believe Alexa is with Amazon and Siri is Apple, Cortana is Microsoft, and there's also Google's Assistant. And this software basically listens until a keyword is said, and then that software wakes up. Voice assistants can now respond to a much larger number of commands and questions. It now can create meaningful responses quickly. And this is largely because of advances in computational linguistics and the vast amount of computing power that we have access to now. When considering using this type of voice assistant technology, however, we have to consider disadvantages like concerns around security and privacy. So voice assisted technology is able to do quite a number of things. It can send and read text messages, make phone calls, and send and read email. It can answer informal questions like what time is it and what's the date. It could actually set timers, alarms, and calendar entries, and set reminders, make lists, and do basic calculations. It can also, through connections with other media, play music or movies, and change the functionality of things around the house, like the thermostat, the lights, alarms, and things like that, and the locks on the door. For leisure or entertainment, it can also tell jokes and stories. Some of the voice assistant technology can also be coupled with other web services to automate certain routines. For instance, saying the word good morning can launch a number of actions to facilitate completion of the morning routine, like turn on the coffee maker, read calendar events, and adjust the thermostat in the morning. With this advance in technology, we also have to be aware of the security issues. So for a time, anyone with access to that device with Alexa, Siri, or Cortana could ask voice-activated questions about your personal information, for instance. So there was a case where a man at the door of a house just asked Siri to open the door, and because the iPad was close to the door opened to a complete stranger. I believe these voice assistant technology now is looking at ways of responding only to unique voices as a way to mitigate security measures related to that.
Happening.
Hello? Okay. There's also issues with the likelihood that inaudible commands that can be created with ultrasound frequencies can also control devices and things without you knowing it. There was a case where a 6-year-old made unauthorized purchase of a dollhouse and 4 pounds of sugar using Siri. And what's more, in addition to that, when the news story hit on television, the broadcaster who would relay what happened would say what the 6-year-old said, which was Siri, buy a dollhouse and 4 pounds of sugar. And that in turn turned on other people's devices and ordered a dollhouse and 4 pounds of sugar. So these unauthorized purchases were happening across places where these devices were turned on. Grave security issue. And then there's also privacy concerns about devices always listening and collecting data about us. And this was evident in when in a murder investigation when the police asked for the Alexa history. So this is evidence that your conversations may be being recorded. Other examples besides voice assisted technology is the actual touchscreen tablet itself in promoting leisure activities. So touchscreen tablets are replacing sort of traditional paper AAC devices and low-tech, what's it called, low-tech strategies in order to support memory that were being made in the past. So now the actual touchscreen tablet is being used to create memory books for reminiscence therapy, for viewing art and art therapy, and playing games. The actual tool, the tablet itself, is also facilitating interactions with others in that you could look at pictures together on iPad or an iPhone, that thereby facilitating those important social contacts. So I don't know if this is a good time to take any questions before we go on to look at Anna again. If not, if I don't hear anyone, then I'll keep going. So looking at all of the risk factors, the areas in cognition that have impacted Anna, we're going to start thinking about a treatment plan for Anna. So just to review, Anna has evidence of impairments in episodic memory and executive functioning, and looking at some of the staging scales. I'm going to say she might be, in stage 3 on the global deterioration scale. We've determined that she has non-modifiable risk factors like her age, the fact that she's female, and modifiable risk factors like hypertension, diabetes, a diet high in saturated fats, lower level of formal education, and physical inactivity. There's also a question of whether she may be depressed, and she may be, even though she has great social contacts through her family, she may be lacking in peers and satisfying social ties as her friends have moved away. So let's look at the use of communication and cognitive compensatory strategies in order to make up for some of the communication and cognitive deficits that Anna is demonstrating, and think about multi-domain interventions to address these modifiable risk factors. And then we're also going to look at ways to capitalize on the protective factors and preserve function. We're going to try to ensure that we're making these decisions about goals by including Anna, so that Anna finds these goals meaningful to her. So here's the treatment plan. So we're going to ensure that hypertension and diabetes are treated, and we do this by asking for blister packs from the pharmacist with medications to treat hypertension and diabetes to make it easier to take the medications. We're going to increase vigorous physical activity. So Anna's agreed to enroll, well, Anna and her husband have enrolled in tennis classes and dancing classes. Anna insisted or showed preference for these activities. And Anna's daughters created a weekly menu of baked rather than fried foods and chose menu items with Anna based on the Mediterranean style diet. So high in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and fish, and low in meat and dairy. The daughters, together with Anna and her husband, created a daily routine incorporating meal times, scheduling leisure activities like playing Candy Crush, which Anna is talking to friends on the phone or using Facebook, as well as regular sleep time. Anna's son labeled all the cupboards so that things could be placed in the same place, and the names of those objects are available should Anna have difficulty retrieving the names of objects. They schedule visits from children and grandchildren so that they provide social stimulation and capitalize on strong social engagement. So to ensure that Anna and her husband get 3 to 5 visits a week. Leisure activities were suggested so that when children are coming to the house, that they have a chance to actually engage in a meaningful way with Anna. So for instance, they made a commitment to show Anna pictures of activities and things that Anna's grandchildren are doing on Facebook and Instagram. They are also going to cook regularly with Anna and her husband when they come to visit. Oops. So children are also going to support Anna's desire to continue cooking for the family. So they will do compensatory things like find all the ingredients and allow Anna to prepare the actual ingredients, like chopping the peppers and the onions, and the garlic, but they would be responsible for bringing it out if that was a difficult task for her. So organizing all the ingredients that were there, or they would make a list of all the ingredients that she would need at particular times, so that she could go to the fridge and find the items herself. They would also be there to provide reminders about when to turn the stove on or when to lower the heat. The children also discussed observing the interactions between their parents to make sure that that Anna's husband was providing the appropriate level of communication and using strategies. So using simple language, fewer open-ended questions, asking yes/no questions, slowing his rate of speech, pausing between ideas, and repeating and paraphrasing information so that Anna was understanding what he was saying. Okay. So how are we doing for time? So we're at the end of the communication part. So if there's a question about communication, maybe we can address it now.
Hi, thank you so much. There are a few communication questions. So I'll just go through some of them. There was a question about making it easier for patients with expressive aphasia to write down what they want to say. Is this something that you would recommend?
It depends on their writing level. So unfortunately, when somebody has an expressive aphasia, it doesn't mean that it's only spoken language. It can mean that their writing is disturbed as well. So unless we're talking more about an apraxia of speech where the person cannot move their mouth and tongue in a coordinated way to formulate words. So that's different. But if the symbol processes involved in creating language are impacted, they may be impacted both in the spoken language and in the written domain. So we have to be a little creative in terms of facilitating conversations so that we're using a combination of yes, no questions, choices, the context to help the person express themselves.
Okay, thank you. There was another question about someone who was diagnosed with semantic dementia and has very little language abilities left. So they are asking what to expect and how can accommodations be made for him?
Yes, it's difficult without really seeing the patient, but I think, capitalizing on those nonverbal communication skills, so the intonation of the voice, also picture communication, sort of looking at the routine in daily life and seeing if you can use an iPad to take pictures of different activities so that the person can go and look through the iPad album and point to the things that he or she wants to say or to talk about. And oftentimes you may have to get the concrete items as well. So if you know the personality of the person and they were always worried about paying their bills on time, you may want to ask about things like the telephone bill and show, is this what you're concerned about? So using context and actual objects or pictures to communicate is the thing that I would recommend. I'd have to be there to sort of really look at the person, but those are general strategies.
Okay, thank you. And then there's one other question with regards to augmentative communication. Someone felt that it was more relevant to people with dementia.
It depends. So in what the purpose is. So if you're using it in a shared way to reminisce about past events and things, then it is quite helpful. If the person's dementia features are more language based, so that it's more of like an aphasia based or primary progressive aphasia, it definitely can be helpful. And also if it's used to, like for dementia, it's memory that's usually the central impairment. So if you're going to be using AAC devices in strategic places like pictures of the purse at the door to remind the person to pick up their purse and take it with them when they leave, then I can see that. But I'm not sure if there'd be that much motivation to use the picture communication board to express themselves if they're able to formulate simple sentences.
Okay, thank you. And Morella has her hand up. So I'm not sure if she's able to speak or if she needs to type in a question. I think it's come down now. There's another question on swallowing, but perhaps we can get to that later.
Sure. Yeah, that's going to be the next section. Anything else?
So there's one other question, which says, my wife is much more responsive when we speak over the phone than when we are visiting in person. Is there any information about this kind of thing?
It's actually an observation that I have made for years, and if I had time, it would be great to do some research on this. I'd love to know what kind of deficits the patient has or the person has, because it does seem like people with aphasia, and particularly those with a bit of apraxia as well, benefit from not having the pressure of the person being there in person to produce language. That's my theory. I haven't actually read anything about it formally in research, but if you're standing in front of the person and asking questions, something about the presence of the person in the room creates pressure, which to perform perhaps. And whereas talking on the phone, something that we have done for most of our lives, with the person not there, somehow takes away the pressure and allows the person to focus on the message that they're saying. So that's my theory, but not proven yet by research.
Thank you very much for answering those questions.
So we're moving on to swallowing now. And swallowing is an act that requires a coordinated sequence of muscle movements to transport food or liquid into the esophagus while protecting the airway. So that's the purpose, is to move food or liquid along to the esophagus without entry into the airway and eventually the lungs. We as speech pathologists or people who study swallowing have divided the normal swallow into 3 phases: the oral phase, the pharyngeal phase, and the esophageal phase. In real life, however, everything sort of happens in an overlapping way, so that it's very difficult to distinguish when one stage ends and the next stage starts. But we have artificially sort of created ways to separate those stages. So within the oral preparation phase, or the oral phase, it consists of oral preparation, the oral transport phase, and what occurs in this phase is the preparation of liquids, so solids and liquids in a sort of cohesive way to get it into or through the oropharynx into the esophagus. So it usually involves the lips. So the lips have to be able to close onto a utensil or around the food and contain it. And our saliva lubricates that food item, and our dentition allows us to break down the food. Our tongue then is used to transport that solid or liquid bolus to the back of the mouth. And the tongue does this in a wave-like stripping motion. And once that bolus has passed through the arches at the back of the throat, then we enter the more reflexive phase of swallowing. So the oral stage is the only stage that's voluntary, that's under our voluntary control. We can control how much we chew. We can control how quickly we start the transport process. But once that bolus has reached that fascial pillar at the back of the mouth, then things sort of happen in an involuntary way. So muscles act and propel the food down through the pharynx and into the esophagus without our voluntary control. Okay. Once the bolus passes the fascia pillars, bolus, I mean, the food item or the liquid, it starts a reaction in simultaneous action. So things that areas where food is not supposed to go are closed, and areas where food is supposed to go, like the esophagus, are opened. So the soft palate elevates and closes the nose or nasal passage, preventing food or liquid from entering there. The throat constricts to allow food to be moved along down to the esophagus. And then several things happen to protect the airway. So your vocal folds close, your Adam's apple or the larynx elevates to close off the airway, and then the epiglottis, which is sort of a lid at the bottom of the tongue, flips over the airway to add further protection to the airway. All of this happens within 1 second or so. Once the food passes through the esophagus or reaches the esophagus, the upper esophageal sphincter, which is normally tight and closed, relaxes and allows food to come through. And then we rely on gravity and peristaltic waves to pass food through the esophagus. Okay, so we'll take a look at the normal swallow now. So if it works. Yes, okay. So here are some landmarks. We've got the skull and the spine, the jaw, the hyoid bone that helps elevate all the muscles in the throat, and the epiglottis that I mentioned. There's the tongue. We don't want anything going in the area that was highlighted in blue, and nothing does. You can see how quickly everything happens. So we've slowed this part of the image down so that you see the transport of the bolus through the mouth, the elevation of the velum to close the nasal passage, and the closure of the airway with the epiglottis, that curly thing at the base of the tongue that flips over the airway. Okay, you can look at it one more time. That was more of a solid or puree bolus that went down. Okay. So that was a normal swallow. We're going to look at a disordered swallow now. So here we see the yellow that's going into the airway, causing the person to cough. And the reason why this is happening in this gentleman is that the bolus has reached the throat, the pharynx, but he doesn't initiate the swallow in time. So because of his late initiation of the swallow, the actual food or liquids are already in the throat. And so when the structures move up to close the airway, they actually displace the liquid and deposit it into the airway. So that's what's happening there. We'll take a look at that one more time. So here we go. That's the air entry. You can see that the process is a little slower in the throat. It sits there for about a second and then initiates a swallow. So that's the delay is the culprit here and resulting in airway entry of the liquid. The good thing is that he is coughing. So at the very least, he does sense it. Sometimes food or liquid goes into the airway and the person does not sense it. So in which case this is silent aspiration. And that can result in pneumonia without any of us being aware, unless we do a video fluoroscopy, to know that there is actually a problem. So typical age-related changes in swallowing results as a result of changes in dentition, so decaying dentition, the need for dentures, and then the dentures being too loose, that kind of thing. So those are things that are typical. Xerostomia, because as we age, we may have other comorbid issues that require medications, and those medication in turn can result in xerostomia. or lack of saliva in the mouth. As we age, we also lose bone density. So our actual jaw density can decrease, resulting in smaller jaws, so mandible and maxilla. So that if you don't have your dentition for your natural dentition, for instance, if there's any weight loss or anything like that, and you may have to keep going in for fittings for your dentures. As we age, our muscles also atrophy, and as they do in the rest of the body, this occurs in the mouth as well. So it results in weak oral movements, which may lead to food being sort of left in the mouth. So you're not strong enough to propel the food as much, so you may have some left in the oral cavity. So that happens in typical aging as well. The pharyngeal swallow initiation is also slightly more delayed in older versus younger people. This is likely due to decreased sensitivity at the fascial pillars, or the areas where when the food passes, it's supposed to trigger the swallow. We could also have changes in our respiratory pattern, so that usually we exhale, swallow, exhale. And so there may be sort of a disruption of that respiratory pattern, leading to maybe some trace penetration or aspiration. And then changes in our laryngeal tone and upper esophageal sphincter tone can lead to things like reflux. So if you remember me saying that the upper esophageal sphincter is usually closed tight, and then the muscle pull from the Adam's apple moving up to close the airway actually causes the esophagus to release or to relax, allowing for food to go in. So as we age, though, your muscles sort of decrease tone, and that esophageal sphincter might be open at rest when it should be closed. And so that makes us vulnerable to reflux. Typically, in aging as well, might take more time to chew foods, and it may take a little bit longer to propel the food back. You may have decreased sensitivity and taste sensation in the oral cavity. There's also higher incidences of penetration, so food or liquid entering the airway but not passing beyond the vocal folds. And then you may have either, like what we said, the esophageal sphincter open at rest when it shouldn't be, or it could be hyper sort of innervated, so that it's closed too tightly. So no matter what you do, it's not opening, and so food can sit there, and rather going into the esophagus can actually result in residue in the pharynx, which can be aspirated later. Okay. Also, the length of time it takes for food to be sort of passed through the esophagus might increase, also putting us at risk for reflux. So increased time to clear from the esophagus. So as mentioned before, medications can result in drying of the mouth, tardive dyskinesia, so involuntary muscle movements. Sedatives can make people drowsy, and so they may be too drowsy to eat or drink safely, and which can result in decreased oral intake overall, or aspiration if you push the person to eat when they are drowsy. And anesthetics placed in the mouth, for instance, can suppress the gag and cough reflex, so that even if food or liquid does enter the airway, they're not able to protect the airway. Okay. Now, let's look at the impact of dementia on swallowing. So, whereas there's increased time in propelling the bolus to the back of the mouth in normal aging, oral praxis is noted in dementia. So, and motor planning deficits, so that you can organize the muscle movements of the tongue in such a pattern to create that stripping wave to move food back. This is correlated with the severity of the dementia. So in advanced dementia, having that coordinated lingual movement to move the bolus back to the back of the mouth will be impaired. And so the person will pocket food in their mouths and have difficulty initiating that movement to propel the food back. So this is very apparent in more severe or advanced dementia. Research also shows that patients with dementia of the Alzheimer's type aspirated more than patients without. So severe, as the disease progress advances, people tend to aspirate more than patients with moderate dementia. So we can expect that the incidences of pneumonia and respiratory illnesses will increase with advancing dementia. So even in the early stages of Alzheimer's, you can see changes in or the beginnings of dysphagia symptoms. So mainly this is because of impaired sensation, leading to increased time to propel the food back, particularly on liquids, greater delay initiating the pharyngeal swallow. So more risk, like that second video, we saw a food or liquid entering the airway. Because of that lack of sensation too in the mouth, along with impaired memory and attention, people with dementia, even in the beginnings, will require some cueing from caregivers to start the swallow. Like compensatory strategies that speech pathologists usually recommend, like the chin tuck, is not as helpful because things like being able to consistently follow that strategy is not reliable, and that discoordination is more of a factor, as well as delay. So it's not just delay, which the chin tuck compensates for, it's also that discoordination. So Logeman et al. Showed that the thinner the liquid, the faster moving that it is, the more likely that it is to be aspirated in people with dementia versus those with Parkinson's disease. So we have what we call nectar thick or mildly thick liquids, honey thick liquids, which is thicker than nectar thick, and then pudding thick, which is thicker still. So more people aspirated on nectar, which is thinner than honey thick with Alzheimer's disease. Again, as I said, postural modifications like the chin tuck, the supraglottic swallow, and other maneuvers that we usually teach patients are not reliable in dementia because people may forget to use them. Medications like dopamine agonists, like ACE inhibitors, have been known to reduce the risk of dysphagia in Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. I'm not sure how or why, but what I know clinically is that ACE inhibitors actually make people cough. So I don't know if that's the mechanism by which people preserve their respiration, but it certainly wouldn't reduce the risk of developing dysphagia. It would just help to keep food or liquid out of the airway because you're coughing more when you're on an ACE inhibitor. So reducing the impact of dementia on swallowing, and in order to do that, we look at environmental factors. So reducing the clutter on tables at mealtime so that the person can focus on the meal itself, reducing ambient distractions so that the person can concentrate on chewing and swallowing food. Setting up predictable routines around meal times. Sometimes people will put on a certain song to sort of indicate that it's a meal time, one song for lunch and one song for dinner. And, if you're used to having specific cutlery or particular cups and things like that, that person feels comfortable with, using those is also a good way to make the person feel comfortable enough to engage in eating activity. Because of this reduced sensation as dementia progresses, it's important to provide adequate sensory stimulation when you're providing meals. So adequate spices, because the taste sensation is actually quite reduced as we age normally, but then more so even with dementia, providing a little bit more warmth or coolness to the food. So heating up food, making sure that it's not sitting there and being served at room temperature. This is a definite issue in hospitals and things where there's just not enough staff to feed people immediately after the trays are delivered. Ensuring that the food or liquid is the right viscosity for the patient in order to facilitate safer swallowing. So one of the things that I encourage people when we talk about swallowing dysfunction and progressive dysphagia in the context of dementia is to have discussions with the person with dysphagia or the person with dementia about what to do as the disease progresses. So important discussions about NG tube insertions and G tube insertions and specific conditions under which these temporary feeding tubes, temporary or permanent feeding tube is placed. So for instance, in Anna's case, right now she's in the early stages of dementia, so she could have a very thorough conversation about this. This would be a good time to discuss what she would want as at the end of progression. And then we also have to consider that even though she's in the early stages now, certain things can happen that may be catastrophic. So a sudden stroke involving a great deal of the brain, or not, maybe it's a specific part of the brain. Having those discussions about what conditions NG tube insertion would be fine, or G tube insertion, and when it would not. So for instance, if Anna today were to have a major stroke on the left side of her brain, impacting language with no hope of recovery, would she want to preserve her life artificially with a G tube? Because she's not in the advanced stages of dementia, but this catastrophic event has now catapulted her into a phase of deterioration where she may not have great quality of life. So when you have those discussions, it's important to have family members there so that everybody's on board and understand the reasoning behind the decisions being made. Because when the time comes, then people aren't distraught about decisions. And so Anna will feel in control of what happens in her future, and family members can rest assured that they are following Anna's wishes. In advanced dementia, most times a G-tube is contraindicated. It's only at the family's insistence that perhaps the medical team might insert a G-tube, but the idea is that a G-tube artificially prolongs life, and in advanced dementia, this is the natural progression of disease, so that at the end of the dementia progression, swallowing will deteriorate to the point where it's non-functional, it's resulting in aspiration and respiratory distress. And so people may not feel comfortable feeding that person, and so the family may wish to stop feeding altogether. Some families want to offer things like ice chips or teaspoons of some nectar or honey thick liquids for oral care. If the person is in distress, a speech pathologist can come in and sort of give other strategies, like, providing a cold metal spoon in the mouth to provide comfort, rather than actually giving something that causes distress in the patient. So my recommendation for people who are living with others that have dementia, or to the person who has dementia themselves, is to have your wishes known about what to do at the end of the dementia progression. That way, both the medical team, the family members are clear about what to do in those cases. It's also important to include other professionals like palliative care consults in order to receive reassurance about the end of life process, and to understand that although we may want to feed the person because we feel that they may be thirsty or hungry, there are natural physiological changes that limit that sensation of wanting to eat or drink at the end of life. And those kinds of discussions and reassurances can be provided by the palliative care team. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. And can welcome questions related to swallowing now.
Thank you so much for sharing. I am just going to backtrack. I missed a question about communication, so I'm just going to ask this, and I know Maria has the other questions around swallowing. So in terms of communication, mom has dementia, is hard of hearing, and refuses to use a hearing aid. This means that I am always shouting to be heard, and a meaningful conversation is nearly impossible. What suggestions do you have in this instance?
This is happening more and more, and now that we're wearing masks, it's even more difficult. But I think the best thing to do is, again, exaggerate your oral motor movements when you're speaking, so that your mom can look at your lips and rely on that to try to decipher what's going on. Picture support may be good. Between those two things, so visual support of communication, I don't know that there's much to do. I think if you can, have more sort of physical contact, reassuring contact, just to give that reassurance that you care, and that may make your mom more interested in trying to figure out what you're saying. The other things that I would do is just be very aware of your vocal tone as well, because when we shout, it does sound, it can sound abrasive. Try to use humor as much as possible, you know, if you can, just to have interactions with your mom, you know, watch movies that don't require language, like the silent shows and things like that. Those are the kinds of things that I would do. I mean, I'm at an age where my parents are also older, and this is kind of an issue as well, but we try to introduce humor to bring levity to the situation, and somehow that lowering our defenses also makes us more a bit amenable to understanding and being receptive to language. So that's my recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Ness. There is a question here from Sharon, and her question relates to swallowing pills.
Okay.
And I will read the question directly. My mom is in the middle stage of vascular dementia. I currently give her medications with applesauce. She also wears dentures, and I remove the lower denture when giving her pills. I prompt her to swallow the pills before giving them to her using both simple words and gestures. I often give her some applesauce before giving her the pills to cue her to swallow, and I don't rush her either. However, she still has the tendency to want to chew all her pills. The problem is that not all pills can be crushed or chewed or come in a liquid form. Any suggestions for how to manage this issue? The efficiency of some of her medications are affected by the fact that she was chewing them. Thank you.
That's a difficult one. Do make sure, if you are speaking to your pharmacist, if there's any other way. I know that you said that it's not available in liquid form, and if you've confirmed that, then there's not much you can do. You can try placing the pill just a little bit further back on her tongue, and then giving her the applesauce to see if that will sort of discourage her from chewing it. And then yeah, like change, you know, the items that you're giving to, so that if it's pudding thick liquids, for instance, it may be better at hiding the actual presence of the pill. Also ask your pharmacist if there's smaller pill forms, so that it's more easily, so if the capsule comes in smaller sizes as well. So you may need to take two to meet the dosage, but if it's small enough, it may be less detected when it's mixed with applesauce or pudding.
Thank you. Okay, there is another question about swallowing as well. And I will read it to you as it's written. My wife in a nursing home for the past 2 years exhibited food pocketing, and the solution that was tried was to serve her food in minced state. This did improve her behavior. I was told that it may progress to the point where her food would have to be served in a pureed form. Could you please comment?
It's true. To avoid pocketing, you know, you want to make it so that the person doesn't have to chew, and they can swallow directly without mastication. So sometimes people masticate, and then once it's masticated, either it's too dry and they keep it in the mouth, or they're not aware of it anymore. The one thing I do is, if the pocketing is occurring because there's decreased sensation on that side, I would put it on the other side if there is increased sensation on that side, if it's more intact. Otherwise, I might give things like thickened fluids with the meal and allow thin liquids between the meals. But liquids, because they sort of rush to the throat, they can initiate a pharyngeal swallow and clear that solid. But thin liquids with those solids are a real mixed consistency, and if the family member has any discoordination, then it makes it difficult to control both the thin liquid and the solid, but if you thicken that liquid, it can actually serve to moisten that pocketed item and help it slide down. So I might suggest that you have thicker liquids with the solids, and to encourage sort of clearance of that soft solid.
I have one that's related to some of the questions earlier. My husband, 95, has moderate dementia with a mild stroke 3 months ago, affecting the left side of his face. Although he eats most things well, I notice his tongue seems to be affected. I give him his medication in applesauce. Any other suggestions that you can make?
That's what we do standard. I don't know if the medication is being given whole or crushed. Crushed meds are horrible tasting. They're very bitter. So I always say that if you are going to mix crushed medications with something, don't give that something as a dessert item, because they're going to associate it with the medication. Really, if the patient is taking the medications well and the medication is not remaining in the mouth, then I think you're doing well. The whole point is really to get the medication down, and if that's working, then no need to change it.
Okay, I'm just keeping track of the time, but perhaps we have time just for one more question. And there was a question on the chat, whether you can provide any information about exercises to keep the muscles used for swallowing and for speech staying strong.
Yes, so one of the things that research has shown is that choir members have a protective factor against dysphagia. So something about singing really helps with respiration and muscle tone. So, and it's a great social activity. So if you can encourage your family member to sing loud for both enjoyment, but also to exercise the vocal folds, the respiratory system, and the muscles in the throat, then it's sort of an activity that targets many goals. The other thing is like using your muscles to blow. Balloons. There's actually an object that they've devised in which you blow at different pressures to work the muscles of the pharynx. But I've made family members blow up balloons of different turgor, so that they are exercising the muscles of their throat. So but you have to be very careful with that, because if they tend to have a vasovagal response or any cardiac issues, then I would suggest doing it. Singing is great. Anything else?
There's a few more. Maybe we can make them brief. So my mother will chew food a little and then remove it from her mouth. Would that be a sign of fear to swallow? At other times, she swallows with no issue at all.
I would have to sort of study what the conditions are. Is it the actual food item? Is it the medication that she took that day that caused, more dryness of the mouth, so that she's having difficulty propelling the food back? Does she just chew a little bit too long, and so there's no flavor left, and the bolus is actually too dry? So maybe the introduction of some liquids, preferably slightly thicker, might help. patients can also, or people can also suffer from something called dysgousia, so a change in, not just a decreased taste sensation, but a change in taste sensation with changes in brain function. So that could also be it. But just keep tabs about, you know, what happened before the meal, what's happening during the meal, what meal is actually being provided, in order to try to understand why your mother might be spitting out the food or expectorating it.
Okay, and can medications be taken with soft bananas?
It can be, but it may be two different solids that the person has to keep track of, and I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you don't want the person to chew the medication. So if it's not to be modified, that medication, if it's a time release capsule, then I wouldn't recommend putting it in something that requires chewing.
Thank you.
And I have one final question on my end. So at what point do you change from solid foods to pureed foods?
When the swallow becomes so inefficient that the person is actually losing weight, I would consider that would be one reason. Another reason is, you know, is the person at risk of obstruction because they're not chewing the food and they're holding the food in their mouth. So if you're not there, or if you turn your head for a second, could they actually not just aspirate but choke? Then I would consider the pureed foods. And in my experience, pureed foods sort of taste the same. You know, if you're making chicken and you're making some other, you know, meat, pureeing it sort of takes the taste out of it. So sometimes what I'll say is, you know, puree the food, but add some gravy or sauces that might, after it's been pureed, not adding it to the actual regular food and then putting it in the blender together. Blend the food and then add the sauce on top, just to add variation in taste.
Thank you so much for your time, Nesanet. That was a lot of great information, and I see a lot of great feedback here. For those in the room, I wanted to say that I posted the evaluation link into the chat window, but I will also be sending it out via email. You will also be receiving the slide deck at a later point, so I will just wait for Nesanet to send that to me. And then in terms of the recording, it will be available several days for now, just to make sure we check the file and make sure everything's good. But it will be posted on the University Health Network Memory Clinic website, as well as the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto's YouTube channel. So again, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.